Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli back out here in the shop with another great tip for you today. And now we're going to be talking about my top 5 finesse lures for early winter fishing. Last time we talked about my top 5 power fishing lures for early winter. Now let's focus on finesse. And there are days when power fishing is the deal. You could throw those bigger baits with a casting rod, make the fish react. But a lot of times in this early winter period, as that water cools, the fish get so tight-lipped, they get so lethargic that power fishing does not work. This is when a spinning rod, light line, and one of these 5 baits really can change your day in early winter. Once again, by early winter, we're talking about cold water temperatures. We're talking about water temperatures anywhere from the mid-40s all the way down to the upper 30s. That's cold water. And because of that, a lot of times finessing is the way to get some bites. Let's start with one of my favorite early winter finesse techniques. And you knew this was going to be in my top 5. And it is a shaky head. A shaky head, also called a jig worm by some people up north. But when you look at a shaky head, it's a very subtle way to get the fish to bite. And when you look at that bait, a shaky head is so good because it falls in a very subtle sort of wandering motion, but once it hits the bottom, and look at this, ready? Nose down, tail up off the bottom, sort of on that 90-degree, 75-degree angle. And as you shake your rod tip, the tail of that shaky worm is just shaking and vibrating, very subtly. For components of a shaky head, whatever your favorite jig head is, mine is a VMC rugby head from a 1/16 of an ounce all the way up to a 1/4, depending on depth. And then to that shaky head jig, I'll add a 4 or 6 inch straight tail worm. This is a 4-inch worm by Berkley called a bottom hopper. And again, the key to me is letting it fall on slack line. It wanders down. But most of your bites in the winter with this finesse technique, early winter, are going to come when that bait's on the bottom, and I just leave it in place and I'll shake it. And that subtle tail movement makes those fish bite. Number 1 finesse bait for me for early winter, for sure, is a shaky head. Number 2, here's another classic for you. Do not leave the house in early winter without this tied on at least one spinning rod. And number 2 is a drop shot. A drop shot. And the drop shot simply is an inline bait tied above the weight, which is on the bottom, right? Look at that. Weight on the bottom, a down lead, and your bait tied in line above that weight. The reason a drop shot is in my top 5 finesse baits for early winter is because it keeps this bait off the bottom in place horizontally. Think about that. That's a very natural thing for forage to do in the winter, right? The water's cold. The forage isn't moving like this. A lot of times the minnows, the little crawfish, the little worms, whatever they're feeding on, they're just off the bottom. And you can adjust this leader length anywhere from 12 inches, 14 inches, all the way to a couple inches. And it keeps it off the bottom and it keeps it in place. And that's really how I like to fish this drop shot in early winter when the water's cold, is I leave it in place. Unlike the shaky head, where I was doing a lot of shaking with my rod, With the drop shot, I let that bait do its own. Just by holding it in place, look at that bait's going to activate, right? That tail's going to activate in the water current just with a little, not even shaking, but just your arm movement. It's going to subtly activate that worm. For a hook, you can use a VMC drop shot style hook and nose hook the bait. If you're around a lot of cover, I like this VMC Finesse Nico hook, and I can Texas rig the bait. And then bait-wise, this has really become one of my favorites because of that subtle tail movement we were just talking about. And this is the 4-inch Berkley Power Bait Flute Worm, which is great on a Nico rig, it's great on a chicken rig, but it's amazing on a drop shot. And it's perfect when that water's in the 30s to mid 40s. So number 2 is a drop shot. Number 3, you've heard a lot about this presentation in the last couple of years, is a Ned Rig. A Ned Rig. And look at this thing, a Ned Rig. Look how simple a Ned Rig is. It's a mushroom style jig head. This is a VMC Finesse Half Moon head with a little stubby 4 or 5 inch piece of plastic on the back. And this one happens to be a Berkley Power Bait Water Bug. Just a little compact 4-inch Power Bait Water Bug. The great thing about the Ned Rig is when those fish are lethargic and they're feeding on the bottom, this thing is just subtle. And it's so easy to fish. When I fish a Ned Rig in this early winter period, I make a long cast and I let it fall on semi-slack line. Occasionally you'll get a bite on the fall, but most of the time, 90% of the time, once it hits the bottom, all I'm going to do with this Ned Rig in the winter, you ready? Drag it real slow up till I get to about 12. Stop. Reel in my slack. So I'm going with my rod from 3 o'clock, real slow, to 12. And that bait is staying on the bottom. And it's just dragging along on the bottom. Just dragging along on the bottom very subtly. Now, as I'm doing that slow drag, if I feel something, if I feel it hit something, I'll stop it and I'll let it float up. The great thing about the Berkley Power Bait Water Bug on a Ned Rig, ready? This bait floats. So when you drag it, it's coming along the bottom. When you stop it, here's what it does. You ready? Kicks up, and your tail stands up and floats. Great presentation when the fish are on the bottom and they're lethargic, okay? So number 3 is a Ned Rig. Number 4 on my top 5 finesse baits for early winter is a jig. Okay, you heard me talk about a jig in my power fishing, top 5 power fishing early winter baits. And here it goes again in my finesse baits. But it's a little different kind of jig. And this is a jig that I developed with Missile called a micro jig, specifically designed for finesse fishing and phenomenal when the water gets cold. If you look at that, it's a small little skirted jig from 1/16 of an ounce up to 1/4. I love the 1/16 and the 1/8 ultralight baits. It's got a fine cut skirt on it. And you could use this with or without a weed guard. So in heavy cover, I'll add the weed guard. In open water, I don't even have a weed guard on there. And just like the Ned Rig, I like to drag this thing very slow along the bottom. So same presentation, letting it fall on a semi-slack line, hits the bottom, rod tip 3 to 12. But this time, if I feel this bait hit something on the bottom, a rock, a piece of wood, a pebble, a stump, whatever, I will stop it and kill it. And the difference between this micro jig and the Ned is that because of that skirt in that cold water, it slowly expands. And this micro jig is an amazing imitation of a crawfish or little bug. And in that early winter period, you'd be surprised how many bass eat small crawfish and even nymphs and larvas off the bottom. Just like a trout. It's crazy. So number 4 of my finesse early winter is a micro jig. And last but not least, and I saved this one for the end because it's going to freak you out a little bit, my number 5 early winter finesse bait is a crankbait. Crankbait. I know what you're thinking. Why do you have this in your category of finesse baits? I'm going to explain it. This is a number 5 or a number 7 Rapala Shad Rap. Probably the best cold water crankbait ever created in the history of mankind. And I include it in my finesse section because it is a finesse crankbait. It's also balsa. It's very light. The 5 and the 7 are both very light. And you're better off throwing these with a spinning rod versus a bait caster. I'll throw this with a 7-4 medium light spinning rod, and I like to throw it on 6 or 8 pound fluorocarbon, straight fluorocarbon. And this crankbait has a super tight wobble. It's balsa. It's got no rattles. It's silent. And the best way to describe this crankbait in early winter is that it sneaks up on them. It sneaks up on them subtly. And just like a bigger crankbait, like a DT, as it's coming along with a tight wobble and it deflects or hits off something, a rock, the bottom, a dock, a piece of brush, when it deflects, when I feel it hit something, I pause and I bow a little. And what that will do is, as that tight wobble crankbait's coming and it hits off something, when I pause and bow, it slowly floats back up. And then I'll start reeling again. And a lot of bites will happen either on that pause or as that little crankbait picks back up. So cold water, little tiny crankbait, a 5 or 7 Shad Rap with a tight wobble. It's the ultimate finesse crankbait for water that's in the 30s and mid 40s. There you have it. And I always carry finesse in early winter along with my power fishing baits, because when you're not eating those bigger reaction baits in the early winter, one of these 5 lures will save the day and help you catch fish. Listen to me, if you like what you're watching, if you like these in the shops, please do me a favor, take a second, hit that subscribe button down there. We're going to get great new educational content to you every week. If you're already subscribed, do me a favor, let your fishing friends know about the Mike Iaconelli Fishing Channel on YouTube. We're going to have great content coming to you every single week. Hope you enjoyed it. They're my top 5 finesse baits for early wintertime fishing. Bye.